Welcome to The Explainer. Let's just jump right into this, shall we? Today we're breaking down a really fascinating and frankly sobering CNN analysis published by the Sunophiles website. We're looking at the anatomy of a stalemate. Specifically, how a brief military intervention between the US and Iran somehow morphed into this deeply entrenched strategic quagmire. Think about the assumptions that usually go into a massive military op like this. The promise is almost always that it's going to be quick, precise, and overwhelmingly effective. But as the reporting shows us today, the world's most powerful military basically found itself trapped in a grinding, prolonged deadlock. We're going to unpack exactly how that happened, step by step, and look at what this whole failure of expectations tells us about the brutal realities of modern conflict.
10 weeks. Just let that number sink in for a second. According to the analysis, this is a war that was originally projected and aggressively marketed to the public to last no more than 6 weeks tops. It was supposed to be this rapid, overwhelming display of force. But here we are, crossing this 70-day mark, grinding into week 10. And the psychological shift here is absolutely massive. What was supposed to be a quick operational win for one side is now viewed as a literal existential fight for survival by the Iranian leadership. And look, when your adversary believes their very existence is on the line, the idea of a swift, tidy resolution, that completely evaporates.
And this dragged-out timeline? It's having an immediate and severe impact domestically in the U.S. As the weeks just keep dragging on, the political options for the current administration are narrowing fast. The analysis points out that the president's domestic approval ratings have absolutely plummeted down to around 30%. And why is that political capital shrinking so incredibly fast? Because public opposition is intensifying every single day that troops are engaged without a clear victory in sight. The White House is looking at a rapidly closing window. They simply don't have the infinite public support you need to sustain an open-ended war.
Adding massive fuel to that domestic fire is the very real economic fallout. Gas prices have crossed the $4.50 a gallon mark. And honestly, how long can any administration sustain a foreign intervention when its citizens are literally paying the price every time they start their cars or try to buy groceries? When a geopolitical crisis halfway across the world directly hits the wallets of everyday citizens, the political clock speeds way up. The public's patience just vanishes. This economic strain isn't just some unfortunate side effect. It's a driving factor that is forcing Washington to desperately search for an exit.
So, how exactly did we get here, and how does it end? Here's our agenda for this explainer. First, we'll look at the 10-week stalemate. Second, the silver bullet failure. Third, surviving traditional military pressure. Fourth, the deadlock at the Strait. And finally, the one-page peace plan. All right, let's start with Section 1, the 10-week stalemate, and a conflict that currently lacks a clear exit.
The crucial point to grasp right out of the gate is the massive, unbridgeable gap between expectation and reality. The entire U.S. approach was built on this very confident expectation of a swift, decisive 6-week campaign. But the reality on the ground? It's a 70-day entrenched conflict, and the administration is really struggling to hide this stark contrast. We've seen the president repeatedly try to draw these highly optimistic comparisons to brief, successful operations, like the removal of Venezuela's leadership. But that narrative spin is actually backfiring. Drawing comparisons to quick victories while your war is stuck in the mud only highlights how thoroughly stalled the current operation actually is. It just clashes way too hard with the facts.
This leaves the U.S. administration completely boxed in. As the source text brilliantly puts it, they are trapped between two crises of their own making, one geopolitical and the other domestic. So what does it mean for a superpower to be in this position? Well, it means Washington is failing to force Tehran to submit using conventional military might, and tough talk alone isn't creating a magic escape route. This feeling of being cornered perfectly explains the panic we're seeing. It explains those sudden, dramatic announcements of new strategies, followed by them quietly abandoning those exact same strategies just days later.
Moving on to Section 2, let's see how this ties into the military strategy itself, which the analysis calls the silver bullet failure.
So the administration tried this calculated, sequential escalation, basically hoping that just one of these steps would be the knockout punch. Imagine the sheer frustration building up in Washington. Step 1, joint targeted campaigns aimed at Iran's highest leadership. That didn't collapse the government. So they crank it up to Step 2, extensive bombing raids on key military infrastructure. Still no collapse. Step 3, naval blockades, explicitly targeting Iranian ports to choke them out. And finally, step 4, this highly publicized grand operation dubbed Project Liberty. The world's premier military was throwing absolutely everything at the wall, escalating tier by tier, and yet the Iranian government stood firm.
And the ultimate symbol of this failure really was Project Liberty. They announced this operation to the world with massive fanfare, trying to project absolute resolve. But instead, it suffered a rapid and frankly embarrassing collapse. Almost immediately, the mission was quietly neutered down to just rescuing a few commercial ships. And then the real shocker. The operation was suspended literally hours after it was announced. Now, the administration hastily claimed they paused it to support peace negotiations, but the CNN analysis argues the exact opposite. This kind of strategic whiplash inside Washington didn't project determination at all. It projected undeniable weakness on the global stage.
Which brings us to this defining quote from Trita Parsi at the Quincy Institute. He describes this entire approach as a silver bullet strategy, based totally on the belief that one single, decisive move could force Iran into submission. Let's unpack why that mentality is so dangerous. When you rely on a silver bullet against a deeply entrenched, highly motivated adversary, you are taking a massive gamble. And when that silver bullet misses, you're left completely exposed with no backup plan, scrambling to figure out what's next while the clock is ticking.
That leads us perfectly into Section 3, surviving traditional military pressure. How exactly did Iran absorb the brunt of all these strikes?
To get this, we have to talk about asymmetric warfare. This is when the two sides have vastly unequal military resources. The smaller state doesn't foolishly try to match the major power tank for tank. Instead, they exploit the larger force's vulnerabilities using unconventional tactics. Think of it like this. If you're fighting a slow-moving giant, you don't stand right in front of it. You run around it. You turn the giant's immense size, its long supply lines, and its domestic political constraints into actual liabilities. The analysis points out this war might just become a textbook historical example of that exact concept.
The contrast in how they approach this is just staggering. The U.S. relied almost entirely on superior operational capability and high-tech precision strikes from a distance, actively avoiding putting boots on the ground. Domestically, that's a smart political move. Nobody wants casualties. But militarily, it meant a decisive regime change was pretty much impossible. On the flip side, the Iranian approach showed incredible internal resilience. When senior officials got assassinated, the system didn't crumble. They just swapped in a new, younger generation of hardliners. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard, maintained super tight internal cohesion, showing literally zero signs of the fragmentation Washington was banking on.
So we've got to look at the undeniable outcomes here. Despite all this unprecedented military pressure, there was no domestic uprising against the Iranian leadership. That was a huge hope for the U.S. that completely failed to happen. On top of that, Tehran hasn't abandoned its nuclear ambitions at all. Actually, they've retained their most dangerous asset, their stockpile of highly enriched uranium. That is a massive strategic defeat. And finally, there are zero guarantees that the IRGC won't just rebuild its vast regional networks in places like Lebanon, Syria, or Gaza the second the dust settles. Traditional military pressure just failed to secure the strategic victory that was promised.
Ian Lesser from the German Marshall Fund really hits the nail on the head here. He notes that the war exposed the enormous gap between American operational capability and the difficulty of achieving a strategic outcome. Let's break that down. Operational capability is your ability to fly a jet, drop a bomb, and destroy a target. The U.S. is completely unmatched there. But a strategic outcome, that means changing your enemy's long-term behavior. And winning isolated battles from the air simply doesn't automatically translate into achieving your grand political goals.
Which brings us to the most critical geographic and economic battlefield of this entire conflict in Section 4, the deadlock at the Straits of Hormuz.
Iran figured out early on that this narrow stretch of water is their ultimate trump card. The Strait of Hormuz is essentially the global economy's jugular vein. By threatening disruptions right there, Iran doesn't just hurt the military. They cause immediate, cascading economic damage around the world. This circles right back to those $4.50 gas prices we talked about. It acts as an incredibly powerful asymmetric deterrence tool, putting massive, unsustainable pressure on Washington. According to the analysis, this geographic leverage has effectively shifted the entire negotiating balance right into Iran's favor.
And this quote just brilliantly illustrates the strategic confusion we've been tracking. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the war is effectively over, but insisted they have to force Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. But as the CNN analysis points out, the irony here is glaring. The strait was actually completely open and functioning before the U.S. military intervention even began. By making the reopening of the strait a central demand now, the U.S. unintentionally exposed a completely self-inflicted disadvantage. They are literally fighting just to get back to square one.
With all of this deadlock suffocating both sides, we arrive at Section 5, the one-page peace plan, and this desperate scramble for an exit.
The absurdity of this diplomatic effort is wild when you compare the proposed plan to the actual historical reality. Look at the left side. The proposed solution is this simple one-page memo, mediated by Pakistan, giving both sides just 30 days to resolve all remaining disputes. It appeals to a very, almost naively, simple negotiation style. But then look at the historical reality on the right. They're trying to solve 5 decades of bitter hostility with a single piece of paper. We are talking about massive, unresolved disagreements over complex nuclear programs, ballistic missiles, demands for total sanctions relief, and the physical struggle for control over global trade routes. Expecting to resolve all of that geopolitical baggage in 30 days based on a one-pager? That is an impossibly tall order.
But look, despite how flawed or overly simple that one-page memo might seem, the stakes are just way too high for anyone to ignore it. As the report concludes, a rapid settlement is urgently needed. Global markets are literally buckling under the strain. You got the safety of American troops, the lives of civilians caught in the crossfire, the stability of energy markets and domestic economies stretched to the breaking point. All of that depends entirely on finding a diplomatic off-ramp. You can just feel the immense, ticking clock pressure Washington is under to secure this exit, no matter how fragile it is.
Which leaves us with this final thought. After analyzing 70 days of grinding deadlock, the complete failure of silver bullet strategies like Project Liberty, the choking of the Strait of Hormuz, and the devastating economic fallout at home, we have to look at the bigger picture. We have to ask, can conventional military superiority ever truly overcome the strategic realities of asymmetric warfare? It's a profound question, and one that's likely going to define global conflicts for decades to come. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this breakdown gave you a clear perspective on the analysis. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.